Ignaz Semmelweis, maybe some of your listeners have heard of him, but he was a Hungarian doctor back in the 1800s. And this was before we knew about germ theory. And so he worked at a Vienna hospital that would train young doctors and midwives, and he inherited a problem. He was basically the chief administrator at this hospital, and they had 2 clinics, and each clinic had a problem with something called childbed fever. And a lot of women would come deliver, they would get sick from this childbed fever and then die 2 or 3 days later. And the interesting thing that he found was for the past 5 years, the doctor's clinic had a mortality rate that was more than double that of the midwives. And this is really troubling because basically you had, and a lot of times with this university hospital, they were treating poor women, prostitutes, and different people, and it was a free service. But he actually would see the women on the street begging to not go to the doctor's clinic because they started to hear that you had a higher chance of dying in that clinic compared to the midwives. And so they looked at the 2 clinics side by side and tried to figure out, why is there this difference? Why is one clinic, the doctor's clinic, worse than the midwives? And so at the time they believed in the theory of miasma, which is they would associate bad smells or foul smells with disease. And so that was one thing that they looked at. They looked at was it the temperature of the rooms being different, or was one room more overcrowded than the other? They even looked at the delivery techniques of the midwives and the doctors to see if that was the cause. And they couldn't figure it out until one day when Ignaz was actually out of town and a fellow colleague of his, another doctor, was performing an autopsy on one of these women that had died of childbed fever. And he was using it as a teaching opportunity with student doctors. And one of the student doctors accidentally cut his hand while he was performing this autopsy, and sure enough, that wound got infected and he died shortly thereafter. And when Ignaz raced back to find out that his friend had died, he had the difficult job of performing the autopsy on him. And that's when he discovered that the pathology of how this man died was very similar to how these women were dying. And then all of a sudden he had that kind of aha moment where he's like, oh my gosh, I wonder, and again, they didn't know about germ theory, so he didn't have that, but he was wondering if there was some particles or something on the cadavers that they were transferring to these women in the clinic. Because what the standard practice of the day, and at this hospital and many other hospitals that were training doctors, was to have the doctors perform autopsies in the morning and then do their rounds of examinations and deliveries the rest of the day. And then he was like, we probably aren't washing our hands properly. And so we're transferring this disease to them. And so anyways, he instituted a policy where they would wash their hands in a chlorine lime solution. And immediately they went, from like a 12.2% mortality rate down to 2.2, an 82% drop. And then for the next several months, it remained relatively low, though it did start to tick up a little bit. And that's when he discovered his first point of resistance, where these young doctors were like, come on, Ignaz is, off his rocker. There's no way that our hands being dirty is causing any problems. This is ridiculous. And so they weren't adhering to his hand washing policy, because imagine you're washing your hands in chlorine lime. So it's going to be stinky on your hands. So anyways, so they weren't adhering to his policy. He found out, cracked down on them and said, no, you're not going to be a part of this program if you don't wash your hands properly. And then for the next year or so, he was able to get their mortality rate in this one doctor's clinic down to 0 a couple of months. They had nobody die, which is unheard of. And the interesting thing, at the end of this time period, so for about 18 months, he had data showing that this hand washing policy was very effective. And yet at the end of when he was about to be, renewed for his position, basically they wouldn't renew him. His superiors basically said, no, his superiors also didn't believe that hand washing was the sole reason for why these women were dying. And so he was, basically rejected by the local medical community.
Oh,
And he had to leave Vienna
knowing that he figured it
he
out, but
knew he
nobody
figured
seemed
it
to care.
out, but he was a little bit passive. He waited 10 years before he published his findings. He actually there's a statement from the book. I don't think I'll be able to quote it verbatim, but he basically said, he just expected his research or his findings to just take flight, that people would discover, in time they would all figure it out, that hand washing is a really good solution. And it never did. And he waited 10 years before he published his research. And then he was a little bit bitter at that point. He called the other doctors murderers and ignoramuses. Not a great way to endear yourself to your audience. I'd never suggest that. But in his lifetime, he never saw his ideas take off. And that's the danger. I kind of put that example in the book as in a danger of, you have a really important insight, and let's check the criteria that we had. Is this something that did he have? Was it valid, or did he have evidence? Yes, he obviously couldn't prove germ theory, but he did have 18 months of data showing that his hand washing policy was successful. Is it actionable? Yes, absolutely. All people had to do was wash their hands.
Wash their hands. Yeah.
And then, is it valuable? Well, yes. Not only at his hospital, but around the world. I mean, this is a practice that was introduced. That a lot of other hospitals were teaching their doctors using autopsies, and it could have saved. I don't have an estimate of how many lives it could have saved, but it could have saved in the thousands of lives. Just women being saved from dying from this needless illness, and yet he wasn't able to communicate it effectively. And in the book I talk about other examples of people from the same time period, most notably Florence Nightingale and then Dr. John Snow, as examples of people who used visualizations and data stories to convince people to actually take action and actually made a difference. And so, it's not just because he didn't have PowerPoint, he didn't have Excel or Tableau or Power BI. Yeah. It's because he didn't follow a data storytelling approach that worked well for these other people in the same time period, the same era. So yeah, it was fascinating, and hopefully it resonates with readers and other people when they hear it. But it's a cautionary tale, I guess, of it doesn't matter if we have a good insight, if we can't communicate it effectively, it will go nowhere.